Have you ever felt as if the world around you hid dark secrets, ready to be revealed at the most unexpected moment? Well, I could never have imagined that my life, so ordinary and peaceful, would unravel into a plot so terrible that it would challenge the very essence of my sanity. My name is John, and what I'm about to tell you is not just any story. It's a personal account, a journey through the shadows that lurk in the folds of what we consider reality. It all started on a seemingly normal day. I was coming home early, eager to surprise my wife, Elizabeth, with whom I had shared my life for over a decade. Our house, an old family heirloom located in a small historic town in the UK, had always been our refuge, our little world. But that day, as I opened the door, the world I knew came crashing down. I found evidence, clear and indisputable, of Elizabeth's betrayal. The initial shock was replaced by a devastating mixture of pain, anger, and disbelief. How could she? We had promises, plans, memories. Everything seemed to be falling apart around me. I confronted her, and with tears in her eyes, she confessed. She said she was sorry, that it had been a mistake, a momentary weakness. But how could I trust her again? How could I look at her and not see the betrayal that had tarnished our love? I decided then that we needed some time apart. I needed space to think, to decide on our future. While I wandered the cold streets of the city trying to organize my thoughts in the midst of the emotional storm that was raging, Elizabeth remained in our house, alone with her guilt and despair. What I didn't know, what I could never have imagined, was that this would be the turning point for a series of events that would unleash a terror so deep and dark that it would make my previous sleepless nights seem like mere annoyances. Elizabeth, in her desperation, resorted to something that was beyond my comprehension at the time. Something that, once unleashed, could not be contained or reversed. And so, without knowing it, I found myself at the center of a vortex of revenge and black magic, from which no one, absolutely no one, would escape unscathed. After that revelation and the subsequent estrangement, my life was never the same again. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting thoughts and emotions. But it was when strange things started to happen that I realized my situation was much more serious than a heart broken by a love betrayal. I began to notice movements in the shadows, as if something or someone was always on the fringes of my vision, lurking. At night, almost imperceptible sounds disturbed me, whispers that seemed to call my name, but in a way that chilled the blood in my veins. I tried to convince myself that it was just stress, insomnia, maybe even the beginnings of a nervous breakdown. But then things got worse. One day, when I got home, I found strange symbols drawn on the walls. They were drawings I'd never seen before, but which I instinctively knew were not good. And the feeling of being watched intensified, becoming almost palpable. It was as if the house suddenly had its own malevolent presence, watching my every move. The nights became a torment. I began to have vivid nightmares in which Elizabeth appeared, not as the woman I loved, but as a creature twisted by hatred and revenge. She blamed me for the breakup, for her pain, and in each dream, her revenge became more cruel and violent. I was lost, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Everything around me seemed to be falling apart, my mind, my reality, my very sense of security. And in the midst of this chaos, a terrible truth began to emerge. Elizabeth's revenge wasn't just emotional or psychological. Somehow she had transcribed her fury and despair into something much darker and more dangerous. I was in the center of a gale, and the worst was yet to come. The weight of the unknown began to consume me, forcing me to seek answers to the disturbing phenomena that had become part of my daily routine. It was this search for explanations that led me to the dark knowledge that Elizabeth had explored. I discovered that she had been involved in black magic, a revelation that shocked me to the marrow. The idea that the woman with whom I shared my life could turn to something so dark was something I simply couldn't comprehend. Desperate for help, I found an occult specialist in town. He listened to me with a somber expression, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pity and fear. He warned me about the danger I was facing, saying that the curse cast on me was powerful and possibly unbreakable. His sincerity and the gravity of his words hit me with the force of a punch in the gut. He tried to offer me solutions, protection rituals and amulets, but confessed that they might not be enough. Despite his warnings, I was determined not to let fear consume me. I followed his advice, surrounding my house and myself with amulets and symbols of protection. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that there might be hope, that perhaps I could find a way out of the darkness that surrounded me. But that hope soon faded. The supernatural activity not only continued, but intensified. The amulet seemed to provoke the entity that haunted me even more, as if every attempt at protection was just more fuel on the fire of its fury. And then, the situation took a new and terrible turn. Elizabeth's revenge began to affect my mind in ways I couldn't have imagined. I heard voices, constant accusations that seemed to come from the walls, from the air, invading my thoughts, leaving me questioning my own sanity. It was a constant torture, a voice that never shut up, always reminding me of the betrayal, the pain, the revenge that I was now facing. At this point, I was completely alone, fighting against a force I didn't fully understand, a force that threatened to consume everything I was. Reality as I knew it had been distorted, transformed into a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. And it was in that moment of despair that I realized the true depth of my situation. I was locked in a battle against something far beyond my ability to understand or fight. As the days dragged on, my fight against the darkness that had taken root in my life became increasingly desperate. The attacks, once subtle and almost insidious, now became violent and physical. One night, I woke up with deep scratches all over my body, with no logical explanation as to how they had appeared. These wounds were tangible proof of the power Elizabeth had unleashed against me, a painful reminder that this battle was far from just psychological. In an effort to claim some sense of normality or security, I tried to modify the space around me, but the house seemed to resist every attempt. Objects that I placed in specific places disappeared or were thrown by invisible forces, and threatening shadows stalked me in every room, a constant presence that made me wonder if I would ever feel safe in my own home again. The situation reached a critical point when, in an act of desperation, I confronted Elizabeth about the horrors that were consuming me. She denied any involvement, but there was something in her gaze, a glint I had never seen before, that told me more than her words ever could. It was a look of satisfaction, almost of triumph, that made me realize that the woman I loved had been lost somewhere along this tortuous path we had taken. And as if to isolate myself even more, I began to notice a change in the behavior of the people around me. Friends and acquaintances were distancing themselves, whispering to each other, looks of suspicion and fear replacing the warm welcomes of yesteryear. The city, with its streets and houses that I knew so well, became strange and hostile, a reflection of the isolation and paranoia that now dominated my life. I was alone, completely alone, in my fight against the curse that had been placed on me. Every attempt to find help or understanding only pushed me deeper into the abyss of despair and madness. The true extent of Elizabeth's revenge was revealed not only in the destruction of my peace and sanity, but also in the erosion of the ties that connected me to the world around me. I was trapped in a web of shadows and suspicion, a victim in a cruel game that I didn't know how to win. In my incessant search for some way to escape, or at least understand the darkness that surrounded me, I made a discovery that forever altered my perception of the situation I found myself in. Among Elizabeth's belongings, hidden under a layer of books and papers, I found a diary. The pages contained a detailed description of the ritual she had performed, words that danced on the edge of the comprehensible, speaking of entities and forces she had summoned to carry out her revenge. As I read her words, a chill ran down my spine. Each sentence was a confirmation that there was no turning back, that the curse was personal, directed at me with a cruel and unbreakable precision. Driven by a mixture of anger and despair, I tried to destroy the artifacts she had used in the ritual, hoping that by doing so I could somehow reverse what had been done. But my attempts were in vain. Every action I took only seemed to strengthen the evil presence that now dominated my life. It was as if the curse was feeding off my resistance, my pain becoming stronger every day. It was then that Elizabeth disappeared. One morning, she simply wasn't there anymore, as if she had been swallowed up by the very darkness she had summoned. Her absence left a void, but it didn't bring relief. On the contrary, I felt as if the connection between us, now marked by the curse, had somehow been intensified by her departure. The house we once shared now seemed like a monument to his vengeance, every room echoing with the promise of his wrath. And then things took an even darker turn. Elizabeth's presence, although she was physically absent, became almost palpable. Her voice whispered in the air, promising eternal pain, each word a stab that tore at what little remained of my hope. The house, our home, had become a prison, the walls seeming to close in on me, a physical manifestation of the curse that condemned me to endless torment. I was trapped, not only physically, but also spiritually, bound to a vengeance that transcended human understanding. With each passing day, the line between reality and nightmare became thinner, and I wondered if there was any way of escaping the darkness that had been woven around me, or if I would be condemned to live in this state of eternal terror, a shadow of the man I had once been. As the days went by, my existence became an endless cycle of terror. The supernatural manifestations I had experienced so far evolved into physical violence that I could never have anticipated. One night I was thrown against the wall by an invisible force with such violence that I was left dazed and bruised, unable to understand how such a thing was possible. It was as if the house itself had turned against me, every corner, every shadow hiding an invisible but palpably violent threat. In this atmosphere of constant fear and vigilance, the house began to change. Corridors that I had previously known changed places. Doors that should have led to familiar rooms opened into dark and unknown spaces. I was lost in my own home, a labyrinth that seemed to reflect the chaos of my mind. The disorientation was total, a torturous mind game that undermined any hope of escape or solution. In one of these episodes of disorientation, I tried to escape, to run out of the house and get help, any help, but the attempt was futile. Some force was pulling me back, literally dragging me through the shadows until I was once again under the roof that had become my prison. These forces, although invisible, were as real as the pain and fear that consumed me. It was clear that there was no way out, that attempts to escape would only serve to intensify the torment imposed on me. Faced with the impossibility of escape, and driven by a last glimmer of hope, I attempted one last ritual, using what little knowledge I had managed to gather in an attempt to break the curse. The ritual, performed with a mixture of desperation and skepticism, culminated in a catastrophic event. Instead of dispelling the forces that haunted me, it seemed to aggravate them, as if my attempt to resist was the final provocation, the last insult to be punished. From that moment on, the house became a hunting ground, and I became the prey. Neighbors began to report hearing terrifying sounds coming from my direction, visions of dark shadows moving for evil purposes. My fight against Elizabeth's curse had become an urban legend, a cautionary tale of rage and revenge taken to its ultimate consequences. It was clear that my battle had transcended personal boundaries to become a horror show for the whole city, a grim reminder that certain lines, once crossed, cannot be redrawn, as the days turned into nights, and the nights dragged on into dark eternities, my reality continued to shatter. I had become a stranger in my own life, watching it unfold as if I were a distant spectator, unable to intervene or alter its course. Elizabeth's revenge, once a whisper of possibility in my mind, now screamed with the force of a gale, relentless and inescapable. Elizabeth's appearances became more frequent, ever more intense and terrifying. She was no longer content to haunt me with her invisible presence. Now she manifested herself, a vision distorted by hatred, the embodiment of pain and revenge. These apparitions were accompanied by physical attacks, moments when I felt the force of her wrath like blows against my body and soul. It was a torture designed to break not only my spirit, but everything I was. In this downward spiral of despair, I clung to the vain hope that documenting my experience might somehow help me find a way out, or at least warn others of the danger that lurked in the shadows of betrayed love. But Elizabeth's curse seemed to predict and twist my every attempt to seek help. The words I wrote distorted, turning into incomprehensible messages or dark warnings that only served to isolate me even more. The surrounding town, once a place of comfort and community, now echoed the isolation and terror that dominated my existence. Neighbors whispered about the house, about the horrors that lived in it, and I had become the center of a web of suspicion and fear. People avoided the area, crossing the street so as not to pass in front of my door, as if the evil that was consuming me could somehow reach them too. It was against this backdrop of desolation that I realized the true extent of Elizabeth's revenge. She wasn't just torturing me. Her aim was to erase me completely. Not just from people's memories, but from reality itself. I was being consumed, not only by fear and pain, but also by the inevitability of oblivion. Every manifestation, every torment was a reminder that I was alone. A prisoner in a house that had become a mausoleum of my own misfortune. As the reality around me faded, my ability to discern between what was real and what was a product of the curse became increasingly blurred. Sanity, a concept I had once taken for granted, was now unstable ground beneath my feet, crumbling with each new assault of terror that Elizabeth conjured up. In my heart, a battle raged between the will to fight and the temptation to surrender to the despair that surrounded me. In a desperate effort to find some way to combat the growing darkness, I scoured the house in search of anything that might offer me an advantage, a thread of hope. That's when I found, hidden away in the attic, an ancient book of magic, its pages worn by time, but still vibrating with a power I could barely comprehend. In my naivety, I believed that perhaps within those pages lay the key to my liberation. But every spell, every ritual I tried only seemed to deepen my misery, as if the book itself was mocking my desperate situation. The more I fought the curse, the more powerful it seemed to become. Elizabeth wasn't just present in the shadows. She had infiltrated my thoughts, my memories, distorting my perception of reality. Her mocking laughter, once a sweet and loving sound, was now the prelude to new horrors that awaited me in every waking moment. Then, on a night that seemed like any other in my new world of shadows, the house was engulfed in a storm like I had never seen before. The skies above opened up with a supernatural fury, lightning tearing through the cloak of night, each clap of thunder a sinister accompaniment to the orchestration of terror that was unfolding inside me. At that moment, I felt as if the storm itself was an extension of Elizabeth's curse, a physical manifestation of her wrath, concentrating on the house, on me, an energy so black and powerful that I feared I wouldn't survive until dawn. It was during this storm, between the chaos of the outside world and the turmoil of my heart, that I understood the true depth of my desolation. I was alone, fighting a battle I couldn't win, trapped in a reality I couldn't escape. And while the storm roared outside, inside me reigned a somber silence. The silence of someone who knows the end is near, but doesn't have the strength to fight it. The night the storm raged with its indomitable fury, Elizabeth's manifestation reached a new level of terror. She appeared before me, clearer and more powerful than I had ever seen her. Her figure, illuminated by the lightning that tore through the sky, was the very image of vengeance consummated. She promised, in a voice that seemed to come from every corner of the house, that this would be our last meeting, the end of my journey through the personal hell she had created for me. Her words, though expected, hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me breathless, hopeless. The struggle that followed was unlike anything I had experienced so far. It was no longer a battle against shadows and invisible presences, but a direct confrontation with the manifestation of Elizabeth's wraith. The energy around her pulsed with an intensity that seemed to distort the very fabric of reality. Everything I tried to hold on to in order to defend myself seemed useless in the face of the power she wielded. The house, my last refuge, trembled and groaned under the weight of this battle, as if it could collapse at any moment. The climax of this confrontation came with an explosion of black energy that seemed to shake the foundations of the house. I was thrown to the ground, feeling every bone in my body vibrate with the impact. All around me, reality seemed to blur, the boundaries between the physical and supernatural worlds becoming indistinct. In that moment, I realized the true extent of what had been done, of the curse that bound me to Elizabeth in such a profound way that neither of us could escape it entirely. In the days that followed, while I recovered from my physical injuries, the wounds to my soul only seemed to deepen. Elizabeth's apparition had disappeared, but her presence, her anger, continued to surround me, a fog of despair and pain that I couldn't dispel. I was broken, both physically and emotionally, trapped in a reality from which I could see no way out. In an act of absolute desperation, I considered a final sacrifice, an attempt to end the curse that bound us. But even that was denied me. One last cruelty in a long series of torments. I had failed, and with that failure came the acceptance that there was no more hope, no more escape. The morning after the last confrontation with Elizabeth dawned strangely calm, as if the storm of the night before had taken with it the rage that had consumed my life. The house, despite the obvious damage, remained standing, a monument to the battle fought inside. But there was no sign of me. I had disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of my existence, a memory faded by the intensity of what had been lived there. News of my sudden absence and the state of the house spread quickly through the city. Investigations were carried out, but no satisfactory explanation could be found for the strange events and my disappearance. Theories varied, but none could capture the true essence of the horror that had unfolded. The house was now viewed with fear, a place marked by tragedy, avoided by all who knew its history. Over time, rumors about what had happened began to mingle with local folklore. The story of my fight against Elizabeth's curse, of the revenge that went beyond what was natural, became an urban legend, a warning about the dangers of betrayal and revenge. The house became known as the place where no one dared to live, where the echoes of the past could still be felt on stormy nights. And so the story ends, not with a happy ending or a moral lesson, but with the somber silence of an empty house, rebuilt but never inhabited again. The marks of my existence, as well as Elizabeth's, have been erased, but the memory of the terror that took place there remains, an eternal shadow over the city. Elizabeth's revenge, although consummated, left a scar on the fabric of reality, a reminder that some stories once begun cannot be undone, and that the price of revenge is a prison from which not even death can free you.